Please note today's session is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much. On behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the April Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar. Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Ross Brownson and Dr. Nola Proctor, who will be joined by our own David Chambers, who will be moderating the session. A very brief word about logistics and we'll be off. If you are not already on mute, we ask that you keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, the session is being recorded and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted by using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the provided Q&A field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation, but we will be opening the session for questions once the discussion period has finished. And with that, I will turn the meeting over to David.
Thank you, Sarah, as always. And as you see the pictures of smiling people in front of you, I want to welcome you to another fireside chat. Of course, these over recent months have been a departure from some of our prior Advanced Topics webinars and are really seizing upon the willingness of our experts, like the two pictured with me here, to share some of their history in terms of how they've been engaged in implementation science over the years, and also to project forward and think about where is the field going. In Ross and Enola, you have two people who have really been at the helm, leaders in the field for any number of years. Ross has this wonderful recognition of the importance of implementation at all levels of the system, someone who has real-world experience working in the policy context and thinking about how do we improve the implementation of evidence-based practices at the state health department level, and then moving into research to really, at, again, all levels of the system, think about how do we implement better care. And Enola, who has a tremendous lineage of experience and expertise around social work and bringing it to improving mental health services across a wide variety of systems, and then moving into implementation science. And at a point when the field within mental health needed leadership, she stepped up and really brought together a huge group of people to think about how do we move the field forward. I think both of them are two key reasons why mental health and cancer remain real bright spots in terms of our ongoing effort to advance the science of implementation. Both of them are also very generous people. Not only have they been longtime Cardinals fans, but they were willing to be very gracious when this Cub fan finally got his dream to see the Cubs win the World Series. There was no negative talk, just support, and it is with that spirit that I'm glad that they're joining us here today. So just to start off, and again, the way that the session, as Sarah indicated, will run, we'll love to take questions and questions from any of you at all times, and we'll integrate them in the discussion. We also have a number of questions that are sort of open-ended that we want to give a chance for us all to benefit from Enola and Ross's wisdom. So the first one, and I'll start with Enola, from your perspective, so when you entered the field, what did you see as the state of implementation science?
Well, thank you, and thank you, David, for this opportunity to be with you and Ross and to chat with people about the field. I think I did not know that the state of the field would be led by a Cubs fan, or I might have had second thoughts. And in fact, I think this is your first confession of being a Cubs fan. But as you said, we won't prolong that unless Ross wants to continue that. So the state of the field, wow. Well, first of all, it was few in number. I think our first national meeting had maybe a couple hundred people. We all fit in one very small room. Interestingly, although we were few in number, it had at that time what I think is one of the most exciting features, which is the transdisciplinarity. There were people addressing the challenge of improving service delivery by implementing evidence-based care in many areas beyond mental health. And I found it so exciting to be learning from people and realizing they were asking some of the same kinds of questions that I was, but I didn't know them, I didn't know their literature, I didn't know their field. So few in number, transdisciplinary. I think we had a very clear mission. This field has always been an impassioned group that is interested in this work for its capacity to improve health service, health care, health interventions, and therefore population health. And then finally, we had few tools, little clarity of language. We had a lot of work to do, and that's what we've been about since.
Thanks, Enola, for that. Ross, your thoughts about the state when you started getting engaged in implementation science?
Yeah, well, I wasn't a Cardinals fan then, nor was I a Cubs fan, but that's changed, and thanks for acknowledging that, David. We could probably filter that through this whole talk, but I guess we shouldn't do that for non-baseball fans. But I think when we started, we were sort of wanting to do a lot of this kind of work, but it didn't have a name. You know, there wasn't a name of implementation science, at least to my knowledge. And I think I agree totally with what Enola said. I think the other part that brought us into this and has kept us in this now for decades has been the underlying natural passion for this being, no matter what our discipline, if we come at this from a research angle, our mission is to have our work show impact. And to me, that's the beauty of implementation science, and what's been really driving the field over these years is that we want to be able to enhance our impact, show the value of our work, show what impact it has, show how it might have more impact, and I think that's really been underlying this over the growth of the field over the years.
Great. And I wonder, maybe starting with you, Ross, was there a specific challenge that inspired you to jump in with both feet? Was it a more general observation, as I think each of you has expressed, or was there a specific problem that you said, you know what, I need to make some progress on this, and that sort of got you into more work in implementation science?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there was. When I started in the field, when I finished my doctorate, I was working in etiologic work in chronic disease epidemiology, and my first real job was in a state health department here in the state of Missouri, and I realized that a couple of things, that we know a lot about etiology. In some ways you could argue we almost know too much about etiologic work in disease. We know about burden, we know about disparities. What we're not doing is applying what we know in terms of intervention science. And I had a lot of work with the state legislature, so I got to kind of see the making of legislation and sausage, that old saying. And then after about 8 years, that was essentially my postdoctoral training, I realized what a gap there was in moving evidence to practice. And then I moved to the academic world and began to work on training, capacity building in evidence-based decision-making, continue to work around the ideas of evidence-based policy, and then our work with the Prevention Research Center to really try to build this body of literature around both the theory, the concepts of evidence-based practice, and then how we do better. So it was this sort of underlying thing to say, you know, we know enough about what's causing people to be unhealthy. Let's do something about it. And that's really what's been driving the work of my teams now over the last several decades.
Thanks, Ross. Enola, same question. Was there a specific challenge that got you going?
Actually, yes. There were two that occurred kind of in combination. I was involved in a series of research projects supported by the National Institute of Mental Health to try to improve the quality of mental health care in non-specialty settings. And one particular challenge was responding to depression in a state system that provides services for older adults. And their mission is not mental health, but our clinical epidemiologic research had shown that there were very high rates of depression among their clients that was unrecognized, untreated. These clients had very fragmented relationships with primary care. And we partnered with that agency over a period of about 3 years to try to understand how they wanted to impact that challenge. And we worked to to adapt and co-locate collaborative care for depression in a setting where it had never been applied before. So it was a real-world need to address all the challenges that we now face in implementation research, born out of a system of care's desire to improve depression care. About that same time, our School of Social Work had adopted a commitment to an evidence-based curriculum, and a very perceptive field instructor, an agency director, said to me, okay, Enola Proctor, I get it. I want my agency to be delivering evidence-based services, but what are the evidence-based ways for me as an organizational leader to bring what I'm finding in the literature into my agency? And that, I did not know the answer to that. And I scouted around and learned that David Chambers had recently joined the NIMH and placed a call. And I think my first question was, after a bit of introduction, what are the evidence-based ways to bring evidence-based interventions into systems of care? And I think you said, we have to talk, we have a field to build. And that's how, that's what really led me to this exciting field.
Well, thank you very much for the conversations have been wonderful over the years, and I wonder now if each of you can reflect over that time how you've seen the field change, because as you said, starting off there wasn't as much capacity as there is now. Maybe starting with you, Enola, can talk a little bit about, as you've seen it, characteristics or things that you would see that represent the field as it currently is today.
Yeah, certainly the field has come a long way. I think we've seen the field advance in two primary arenas. One is kind of intellectual capacity, or the scientific tools and concepts. We've seen conceptual models, we have seen measures develop, we've seen language begin to gel, we've seen research designs be shaped for the kinds of unique challenges that our research faces. So, the scientific toolkit has certainly advanced. And then equally exciting, the intellectual capacity, or the field as a whole in terms of building a body of people committed to this research and helping their capacity deepen, so that now we do have, we're more in numbers, but we're also, we have an expertise in our field for these scientific challenges.
Ross, similar question, how you've seen the field change over the years and what it looks like to you now?
Yeah, I think they're related to what Enola said. I think on a broad scale, there's just a wider recognition of the need for implementation science, the terminology, both the scientific part, but then sort of the practical need for the science and the application. And I think that applies sort of within the U.S. across agencies, whether it's governmental agencies or non-governmental agencies or even the private sector, and then across countries, so in Canada or Australia, you might use a different terminology for D&I research, but many of the concepts are similar, and certainly as much good work is going on there as there is here. I think there's also growing recognition among practitioners that we need more of this kind of work, and that it builds partnerships that can be mutually beneficial to both the research enterprise and the practice and policy enterprise. And then I guess sort of practically, just things like there's now, targeted funding announcements, both the parent announcement for the D&I funding, but also many different institutes and agencies, both at NIH, CDC, PCORI, a lot of the sort of different parts of government that are funding this, and then a dedicated study section for D&I research. I think all of those things are vastly different than it was a few decades ago, and I think all very important for our field.
Thanks. A reminder to folks that, of course, at any point, feel free to start submitting questions. Something that Enola had spoken about was this notion of building capacity, and certainly, Ross, you and Enola have both really been leading the way in trying to think about what does the field need in order to produce as much good science and have as great an impact as possible. But capacity is a bit of a hard thing to try and define. I wonder if you could each, and let's start with Ross, talk a little bit about how you define capacity through the different efforts that you've done to try and train and build resources, and maybe say a little bit about what you've identified as some of the most important areas for people who are interested in the field to know about.
Sure, I'll start with that one, David.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so if you think of capacity, maybe first I'll say capacity for an agency sort of out in the world, and that one is sort of the ability, both from the resources, the structures to develop what you might call the preventative dose of an evidence-based practice. That can be a practice or a policy. If we think more for most of the attendees on this webinar, sort of research capacity, I think of it as a combination of individual level skills and attributes and organizational level structures and attributes, and those interact. So individuals influence organizations or make up organizations, and then organizations like a research university also has a direct influence on the individual. And so capacity has to be thinking both about the individual and the organization, and then sort of how the organizational tentacles, if you will, reach out into the outside world. And we've been working on this, actually Nola and I and Doug Luke have been working on a summary of our capacity building activities here, and we organize it by people, settings, and activities. All are important and all have a direct impact on the capacity. If you think of each one of you on the call of trying to build your own D&I research enterprise, it's a combination of those things. And so in people, you might want to try to build a skill set. You might want to identify what the competencies are and how to build those skill sets. In our organization, you might think about the internal capacity that you have, who your colleagues are, all the way down to the physical space. And then just as important for D&I research is that external linkages to our partners and stakeholders. And I guess the last thing I'd say underlying all that and capacity is the passion we have for our field, and then a good dose of tenacity, that it's hard work getting this stuff done. It's worth all the work, but you have to kind of stick with it over a long period of time. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, Enola, you want to talk a little bit about how you see capacity being defined?
Yeah, that was really a terrific and very comprehensive set of the capacities that I think are needed both to conduct this research and most importantly to improve care by acting on the research that we're developing. One of my favorite papers, Karen Emmons authored about the practice infrastructure or the requisites that have to happen in a particular setting before we can expect moving new interventions into place. And certainly the three of us have had opportunity to be very involved in training and help researchers develop their own capacity. I think, you know, that any setting, we also need resources to do this work in terms of funding. That's a really important issue. We need teams. You know, I think if I were to think of the things that people need to do this work, in addition to the tenacity, it's a quite varied skill set, and I think none of us can be skilled in all the domains that are required for implementation research, so I just can't emphasize enough the importance of working in a team context.
Great. So one of the backdrops for this particular fireside chat was recognizing that I think it's been about 5 years since the publication, the 10 key ingredients for successful dissemination and implementation research that Enola led. And since that time, Ross, some of the work that you've done in concert has been trying to distill what are key competencies for individuals to have in implementation science. I wonder at this point if each of you might reflect on how your sense of competencies needed for the field has changed over recent years. Enola, do you want to start a little bit? And even just reflecting back on that 10 key ingredients, are there 11, 12, 13 different ingredients that have popped up that more recently have come into your consciousness?
Yeah, well, you know, in that paper, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is in implementation science, and it is quite old, or 5 years old, 6 years old, I think, and it reflected some of the components that I think are often forgotten, particularly as people move from doing more clinically focused or effectiveness trials into implementation science. It's certainly being aware of the importance of the context. You know, I always say, don't try to implement something if you're completely swimming upstream against the tide of what people want to do, what people want to pay for, and what institutions want to deliver. So knowing the context, knowing the policy context, I continue to think that is so important. Also, I think something that actually may not have been in that paper, I'd have to look back to see. Certainly we've moved from thinking just about barriers and facilitators to thinking of actual tools to either disseminate or implement, or to design interventions to facilitate their uptake. So there are a lot of strategies that have come on the scene, I think, since that paper. And the most recent program announcement, the PAR 16238, emphasizes that one of the most important questions that can be asking is, what is the effectiveness of various implementation strategies that fit, that are appropriate for the setting, and that have some evidence. It's really answering that agency director's question. So certainly more robust measurement and attention to either dissemination strategies or implementation strategies, and rigorously testing those. I think, however, it comes back to not included in the 10 tips because it was sort of the overarching issue. It's the question. No research can be better than the question that it is seeking to address. And I think over time, with maturation of our field and its capacity, I think we're now able to tackle more complex, more sophisticated, and therefore more relevant questions, because we have a better array of measures for control and capture of factors that play into that, and we have designs that can account for that complexity. So, you know, we may want to talk later about questions, but I think I would end kind of where that paper started, that it is all about the question, and the field has certainly changed in terms of the scope and relevance of the questions we're asking.
Thanks, Enola. And Ross, given that you've now taken on more of the mapping of different competencies for implementation science, your thoughts about how they've changed over time?
Yeah, I think with sort of layering on what Enola said, you know, what we've been trying to do more recently is map some of these competencies down to a little more of the fine-grained level. So one article comes to mind, the one that Maggie Paddock here with our team led in another implementation science review, where we brainstormed a set of competencies, but then we card sorted them to look at those that are beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and we have 43 specific competencies. So I think part of where this is going, I feel like we're doing pretty well overall in capacity building around beginning and intermediate competencies, but still have some ways to go around how really to address the more advanced competencies. And so I think something, you know, the take home maybe for the group on the line is, we know quite a bit about what the competencies are. We might think about, are these in my own skill set, or are they in a skill set of those on my team, or are they on a skill set where I need to seek someone else on my team, a different discipline, or someone outside my own organization to make sure that my own research endeavor is robust and meaningful as possible. So I think that's kind of the next stage of the competency development process and implementation.
Thanks.
And for everyone on the line, David, I'm going to jump in really quickly. The resources that are being mentioned, you can download some quick links that are located in the chat, so I am updating that as things are mentioned. So the competency paper, links to funding, links to 10 green ingredients, you can follow along on the chat on the right-hand side of your screen.
Thanks, Sarah. So both of you have, over the last few years, had training programs that each of you has worked on the others as PI. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and Ross, we can start with you, what you've learned from running and this would be the mentor training, dissemination, implementation research in cancer, and then Enola's Implementation Research Institute. A little bit about what you've learned from running those programs over the years that would be of help to folks tuning in today.
Yeah, so I think a few of the things that struck me thinking about this. One, I think Enola alluded to this, the quality of the science is improving. And I think over the time we've been seeing as scholars come into this field, and then many now are leaders in the field that were sort of early scholars in a number of these training programs. So the quality of the science, and of course people are the ones who do science, so the quality of the people coming in. I think probably both Enola and I would say, you know, when we look at our annual applicants to both of our training programs, it's just impressive the amount of skills. I mean, this year we would have loved to take every person who applied to our training program, and the decisions were very difficult. So I think that quality part is really important. The energy, the enthusiasm, I think the recognition of a field has changed over time, and I think that's very important. I think we've also seen in some of these training programs sort of what I call discipline switching, where I say, well, I'm an economist, but I really want to learn implementation science as this sort of cross-cutting science that it will link me up to other sciences and will make my work in economics more meaningful, and I think that's been very important. I think the sort of notion that our field is more and more relevant to the policy and practice is important. Maybe the idea that building what I call the critical mass in an organization, so if we build enough capacity by getting enough people trained at a certain organization, that leads to the idea of critical mass. That leads to the idea of shared ownership at an organization, and it builds institutional commitment. And Enola mentioned there are resources needed to be able to carry this off in each of your own settings. And I think that comes often by what I call collective capacity. And I think that's also very important, and we've seen that happen over time as we've seen this field build up.
Thanks. And Enola, from your experience now a number of years running the Implementation Research Institute, what comes to mind as lessons learned?
Well, first I'll add something that is actually rather selfish. I have loved being at the center of some training programs in implementation science because of how much I have learned. I've always said that training in implementation science has been a late career postdoc, as well as a whole lot of fun, because as David knows, one of the challenges we had getting our first effort at a training proposal funded was pushback from reviewers about how do you train in a field that hasn't yet matured. And to me, that was the point. We shaped the Training Institute so that we knew that we would always be bringing something new to it, and that it would be a very collaborative kind of environment where we would be training the people who would be contributing to that intellectual capital that the field needed that I spoke of earlier. So it's been immensely rewarding, both from relationships and sharing in our trainees' accomplishments, but also just probably a highlight of my whole career has been seeing and helping to foster a field develop by bringing new material in all the time. I think, too, I want to underscore what something Ross mentioned. It's the incredible demand. We are so limited in the number of slots that we have, and it is really wrenching to make the selections. I think I really am grateful to the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Cancer Institute for supporting these field-specific training programs, and to the efforts through TIPE to do NIH-wide training. I think that the last thing that I would add would be seeing centers of excellence pop up, stimulated in part by the training programs that people have participated in, but also by, I think, a very clear expectation in these training programs that people are going to go back and become leaders in implementation science in their own institutions, in their own professional circles. We've seen special interest groups in implementation science pop up in several professional societies. We have seen universities develop a critical mass of people interested in this, sort of mirroring what happens at NIH when it may be across departments and across fields. You know, seeing the field take off in these hubs that are flourishing all over the country, I think I've learned the incredible capacity that our field has to thrive and spread. Spread and scale is an interesting concept in our science, and I'm seeing it in the creation of infrastructure by our trainees.
Great. So a related question that was sent to me. Each of you have, of course, with your research training programs, had to fit the scope of a given announcement. In both of your cases, they're slightly different, but this R25 research education mechanism. I wonder if you were able to cast off the sort of shackles of any given call for applications. Can you talk a little bit about what would the ideal training, or maybe you found it already, but if not, what would the ideal version of your either MT-DIRC or IRI or even tighter look like? What would you think would be the vision that you would like to see happen? And Ross, you wanna start us on that one?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I think it would maybe be thinking of sort of how the Cochrane collaboration is developed, where they have these centers of excellence sort of around, so that we've got a combination of regional training centers. I think HRSA has done this with some of their public health and medical training, where you've got these regional centers where you actually have people doing sort of hands-on training, capacity building that way, but then you've got regional sort of virtual outreach of these centers, so that if I'm in a small university and it doesn't have a big research mission, but I want to learn this and I'm not able to travel long distances to do it, how do I learn about it? Somewhat through venues like this, where there's some virtual, electronic ways of learning about it, and then maybe the sort of building these learning collaborative ideas into sort of implementation science learning collaboratives. I think researchers really benefit and focus on research products, so building little teams. We've seen some of the best examples from our MT-DIRC training, where teams of researchers work on grants and pubs together, and then they see the value of working with other researchers. So I think some sort of decentralized model where there's an ongoing long-term commitment. The challenge with all of the training grants is you get a defined cycle of funding, and then you're hopefully being able to renew it, or sometimes not, and then all the capacity you began to build up just sort of disappears.
Enola, your thought, the ideal version of the training program.
What an interesting question. question. I will say one thing that I think is maybe not ideal but optimal that both MT-DIRC and IRI has that TIDER has not, and that is the ongoing relationship that these two programs build in with a mentor for 2 years, and for the 2-year nature of the training. Over and over, we have IRI fellows and MT-DIRC fellows say, boy, it was such a different experience my second year because I was really deeply immersed in the material and in the notion. But a couple things that I think I would want to see in an ideal training. One would be and this builds somewhat on the collaborative notion that Ross was mentioned. I would like to see resources that would enable trainees to experience in sort of a lab setting, a partnership with a setting where they're doing their implementation research. We have very limited resources. We can pay very few people. Most of the budgets for our 25s go to trainees' lodging and travel to the Institute. So we have a component where we call it a learning site visit, where our fellows travel to the site of an NIH or VA funded R01 in implementation science, someone they don't know, somebody they haven't worked with. And we have a very generous field in which people are willing to host a visiting fellow. But that's like for a couple of days. It's an imposition on the host, and it's only, as I said, through their graciousness that we can't reimburse them in any way, shape, or form. But I wish we could seed that somehow and offer some support to that experience. Our participants tell us that they learn a lot, and this is always, they must do this visit between their first and second year. So, they're learning through didactic and experiential and hands-on activities in a learning situation, but then to go to the real world and have an assignment that maps that curriculum onto their visit, it brings it alive to them. We've seen research collaborations. We've seen people move, which might be a risky thing from the perspective of the host institution that our fellows start, but those collaborations have been very, very dynamic. And then I wish we could do, as we were able to do in our first round of funding, I wish we could provide some pilot funding, and we're prohibited by that in the current program announcement. But Ross and I have heard here at Washington University from people moving into this field how important it is to do some preliminary work to establish rates of variation, to establish the feasibility of a proposed set of research procedures. So I wish we could help people get started in those two ways. So those are just a couple of ideas that build on Ross's great list.
Great, thanks so much. And we're starting to see a few questions come in, so keep them coming. I'm going to bring Anita's right here, and that's a question about mixed methods. Would you, and whoever wants to start, suggest that training and experience in mixed methods is essential to succeeding as an implementation researcher?
Well, I think, yeah, I'll tackle that. I'm tempted to say yes. But one of the changes that I think I haven't had opportunity to mention in the field is its growing complexity. So I think our field is getting more specialized and more varied in its methods. So I started to say yes, because everybody needs to understand the nuances and capture the experiences of implementation on the ground. But I think increasingly there is space in this field too, and will be increasingly for leveraging existing data. So I would say not everybody needs to have mixed methods, but I think for the field as a whole, it's a really critical element of our methodological toolkit.
Okay, Ross, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would add just a little. I think that, always let your research questions, drive what methods you need. So you don't need mixed methods for every study, but for many studies they do present an advantage. You know, certainly the writings by Creswell and by Larry Palinkas are very helpful. You know, to me, what I see a lot of in sort of use of mixed methods is they'll have a team member who is very good with quantitative methods, and they'll have another team member very good with qualitative methods. But, you know, true mixed methods is the integration of those methods, whether they're sort of parallel or one is informing the other. So I would say if you're going to put an emphasis on something, it's either learning about how to do that integration or finding the right team member who can do if you're going to call it mixed methods, I guess really do mixed methods, because I have seen on study section numerous times where people call it a mixed method study, but they don't integrate the methods well, and it ends up hurting them in the ability to get funded. But I think in many cases it's an advantage. There's more and more great resources out there. I know NIH has built this into numerous parts of different trainings, and so that I think can be very helpful.
Yeah, but I think you're right. A very good note that sometimes there's gravity pulling people toward assuming that a particular design is in vogue, and mixed methods being one of those areas that comes up as being in vogue doesn't necessarily mean that by saying it's mixed methods, you're doing as good a job. So where one is moving in that area, ensuring that it is as optimal a design and optimal integration of qualitative and quantitative methods, I think each of you is saying is essential, not just the terminology being used. So I wanted to I'm noticing another question that looks actually like a follow-up to what I'm about to say, and that gets into a question around partnerships being needed for research. And I wonder if each of you can talk about the partnerships that you think are needed to grow implementation science. And in past discussions of building capacity within the field, we've sort of had two different takes on partnerships, one of which is the partnerships with different sort of delivery systems, those who are delivering the interventions that we're trying to implement. And then the second one being the partnerships around different disciplines. Maybe we'd start with Ross. I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about, as you're seeing partnerships needed, with those two categories in mind, what your guidance to folks listening would be in terms of developing or building those partnerships.
Yeah, great question. So, and I might add even a third, which often we think of in participatory research, is the partnership with actual community members or the ultimate recipient or beneficiary of an evidence-based practice. So I think we, first of all, start by defining the partner broadly, and really all three of those levels, so the delivery system, the scientific disciplines that are needed within your own team, or sort of the research areas that to be covered, and then many times a project can be informed by a community member or a stakeholder who might have something to say, especially if you're doing a hybrid trial where you're still studying effectiveness of an intervention and not only a D&I kind of a study. I think that and we actually have a really nice chapter in our book that Meredith Minkler authored on applying community-based participatory research principles to D&I research. And, you know, CBPR aficionados really know how to study this and apply it. There's a set of usually 10 to 12 principles of working with partners that many of which are sort of common sense, but oftentimes, you know, recognize people's strengths, try to equalize power whenever possible, understand how to get information from a practice setting. I think kind of learning and applying those principles of participatory research are often very helpful, making it a co-learning experience, whether it's with the delivery system or with the disciplines in science that we're working with. And I guess just sort of the non-technical areas is spend time in each other's worlds when you're learning about what a partner might bring and how you might work together. Ask them for ideas. Maybe you don't use the research terminology with a partner, but ask about their ideas. It's often about program or policy evaluation is what a practice agency is often looking for, and how does an evaluation question for them turn into a D&I research question for you? Often we might use slightly different terminology, but we're trying to accomplish the same thing. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is equalize power and be humble. Realize that everyone is an expert in their own right, and don't assume that because someone has more degrees and more sort of academic skills that they're any more of an expert than someone that's on the front line of clinical delivery or public health delivery.
Nola, anything to add? I don't know if we're losing you.
I think we lost Nola briefly, but I will work to get her connected, and we can maybe jump to the next question, and we'll come right back. How about that?
That sounds perfect. And this is, I think, Ross, you started touching upon it, but the related question was speaking to resources and specific strategies that might be successful for role clarity and acceptance among research teams. And the example Samantha gives, it's challenging for pre-tenure collaborators to equitably share the load, particularly when working across a number of institutions. So pragmatic ways that you can think of for establishing roles and responsibilities, meeting everyone's needs, but also, I think, embedded in the question, recognizing the constraints of some team members. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's making expectations really clear for the team members. Having a team come up with some early victories. So maybe there's a data set that the team can dive into right away, and in an academic world it leads to a fairly short turnaround on a publication, maybe a pilot project or something else on a small scale that will show success, especially for sort of the early career people. You know, you can't launch into oh, here's a 15-year study where we'll be able to have the dividends will pay in 15 years. Well, by then I hope I'm a full professor and I need to have something that's more short term. And I think those sorts of early victories, identifying gaps in a team where you've got certain capacity areas that you'd like to build, I think that can also be helpful in building up the discipline in some of these partnership and capacity related issues.
Okay, thanks for that. And Nola, I think can hear us, but there may be some connection problem that we're trying to address, and we may have addressed it. I'm just looking at the changing of icons in here. While we're trying to address it, another question comes from Ron Myers. Could you summarize your thoughts about models or frameworks that can guide implementation research, specifically, I think, in health systems?
And David, I think we have Nola if she wants to say hello.
Yeah,
perfect.
So sorry, I don't know what happened, but I'm back. I didn't hear the question, so maybe Ross can start and I'll catch up.
Yeah, and this is thoughts about models and frameworks guiding implementation research in health systems. Ross, you want to start?
Yeah, so there's a wide array of models and frameworks out there. You know, we've cataloged over 60 of them, and of course we've worked with Borsika Rabin and her team to build this models website. So I think a good starting point is to look at the sorts of research questions. It helps in our terminology if you if Ron, if you're doing health systems kind of work, you know, does this look more like a D study or more like an I study or a little bit of both? Kind of narrow down on some of the existing frameworks. Our general advice to people is there's over 60 frameworks and models out there, so you probably don't need to invent a new one. There's probably one, maybe you borrow from a couple or three of them to build the model or framework that works for your project, but you know, start with that. Looked at almost always there's going to need some modification and adaptation needed, and sort of build on what's already out there. If you're building it as a research study versus a practice study, you're going to care about measurement and analytic strategy. So sometimes people default toward some of the models and frameworks where more measurement work has been developed. So there's a lot of those sorts of considerations that go into play, and we'll post up a few of the articles, and then the dissemination implementation models website, if you just Google that, that'll bring up a good example. That's probably the best starting point when you're starting to look at the choice of a model.
And both of those are actually in the chat if you're following along on the WebEx chat space.
Great,
and
there you go.
Things to add around the models?
Yeah, just briefly, I think about models in the same way that that we were talking earlier about methods, and that it should, the question and the setting should drive your choice of a model, because, you know, let's remember the purpose of theories and models. They're to help us fully specify our measurement and analysis. So we don't want to leave something out that's really critical, but we also know that it's not necessary to put everything into a model. So I think one should approach the choice of a model thinking about perhaps the setting and the question, and doing a literature review or search. You know, if you've got a couple of models that you're thinking about, run a search using Implementation Science's article search tab and see how has the CFR or another model been applied in a particular, in critical care or in public health, and see if that makes sense. And don't be afraid to, I would encourage people to not become a model adherent, that they have model will travel, but rather view a model as a tool to help ensure that you're measuring and seeking to understand the most important factors in a particular research study.
Great. Let me pull in another question from Borshika, who asks, one of the challenges in learning about D&I being the limited capacity of the current programs. IRI, TIDE, or MT-DIRC all have caps in terms of how many people they can entertain in a given year. What are some ways, she asks, that we can expand our training for D&I? Any thoughts?
Well, I think, you know, two or three things come to mind. One is trying to get support for more formal training programs. Another one is leveraging institutional opportunities, and the third would be leveraging networking and collaboration and virtual learning. So back to trying to seed more formal training programs. You know, I know that other institutes are also trying to advance the implementation science. So some of you who have done training funded by a particular NIH institute or center might explore the interest in starting some training, although, you know, I know that institutional support for training is limited, but some of our IRI alums have subsequently secured T32 programs in implementation science. So that is both federally funded, but also institutionally based. It's at their home institution. Short of funding, start courses, special interest groups and professional societies, propose methodological workshops pre-conference or post-conference. I've participated in a lot of those, so a lot of the Society for Medical Decision Making, the Society for Social Work and Research have all had pre-conference institutes in implementation research methodology. So think creatively about any of those alternatives, and I'm sure there are more.
Sarah, you want to just jump in for a sec?
I do. Thanks, David. I wanted to give everyone on the line, we have about 5 minutes left of today's call, and this is a great opportunity to ask any questions you might have of Enola, Ross, or even David. We can lob a few hardballs his way to continue the baseball metaphor. So if you have not yet already submitted your question, I would definitely encourage you to do so in the chat or the Q&A, because we have their generous donation of time, and so we want to make sure everyone who has a question gets one answered.
Great, and while we're waiting for that, let me ask a question starting with Ross. What advice do each of you have for early career investigators who are contemplating a career in this field?
I think that, my advice is probably always the career advice I give, and that is find the passion in the field and then let your career follow that. So find the area you really care about. I think the beauty of implementation science is that it really works on the idea of impact, that it helps us to operationalize why we all came into this field in the first place, is that we want our research to make a difference. And so find that area and then really stick with it. You know, I've said this quite a bit, and some on the phone I know our trainees have heard me say this, but you know, my last few large grants started out as not discussed. So for an early career person, that can be just demoralizing, but it turns out that they're fundable, you know, and so really stick with it. If you have a good idea, stick with it and keep making it happen. And I think that's really important. You know, find an environment that is supportive of this kind of work, and if it's not the environment you're in, work on some of the things Enola said about how you build that environment and build that culture that's supportive of implementation science. If it's never going to happen and this is what you really care about, then what is it going to take to move to a place eventually that does support that? So, you know, finding your niche, sticking with it. I think one other thing is sort of if you're what I call the lone wolf syndrome, where you're one of a kind in an organization and you're having a hard time building it, how do you build more of a virtual network where you're going to have support for the kind of work you're trying to do?
Great. Enola, same question?
Yeah, that was great. I would say go for it. Find or build a team. Be relentless in your seeking out opportunities to learn. Go for it.
Great. So I'm going to put my final question in here, which is really, so, you know, you're talking to a lot of people, but among them are certainly people who sit at different funding organizations like NIH. And I wonder, what advice do you have for us in terms of things that funding organizations should do to advance implementation science further? Feel free, as you like. Enola, any advice you have for us?
Yeah, well, that's a tall order, but yeah, I'll add a couple of thoughts. One is, I think existing funding mechanisms can be tweaked in a way that will encourage the acceleration of translation. For instance, effectiveness trials can be encouraged to also address service delivery context, or to address, you know, workforce, you know, thinking about who would deliver these interventions. Urging transparency and reporting about refusal rates, because, you know, one of my big surprises was when I delved into an area of literature on clinical research, I found that the refusal rates in the lab were just as high as they were in the real world. So if we know that, and if we're looking for, you know, bringing in a little bit more external validity into effectiveness and efficacy trials even, that will help us accelerate translation. And then I think encouraging team science through budgets or through review or through enlarging the realm of issues that any given project should address. That will mean that even if there aren't opportunities for new program announcements, which of course would be wonderful, but even if there aren't opportunities for program announcements, if we could kind of scour what we have going on now and ask, how can we leverage that to try to accelerate the public health benefit of the research that our institutes are funding?
Great. Ross, a quick addition to that?
Yeah, the ones that was exactly one of the ones I was going to note, was sort of helping us show the benefit and value added of implementation science. So if we have to make the case to our congressperson, what can we say about why they should put more emphasis and funding into implementation science? Sometimes that it's more scientific, but more often it's stories, something that they can tell to their constituents, the relevance, what will evoke, you know, a positive feeling or even an emotion about something. And then I think it's also continuing what you've been doing there, David, where educating other program officers in funding agencies about what implementation science is, why they should care about it, and how they can enhance it in their own funding announcements and the people they work with. You know, pay lines are tough. They're probably not going to get a whole lot better, but the way you overcome those is get more quality applications in. You know, it's all a numbers game, and if there's a percentile, you just want to get a larger number of high-quality D&I applications, and then by virtue of pay lines and how they work, we're going to have more funded work in implementation science, and I think that's an important one. I know you've made strides in that, but we need to continue it because program officers come and go, and we need to continually have them on board so that they can help us sell this out to the world.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you. I'm going to turn things over to Sarah to finish this out. So thanks.
Thank you, David. So I also want to extend my thanks to Enola, Ross, and David for their time today and for you joining us for today's session. Your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete our online evaluation. A link to the survey will open a new window once this session is concluded. An archive of today's session will be made available on our website in approximately 1 week's time. We hope to see you at our next session to be held in May, and registration details will be emailed in the coming weeks. Thank you again for joining today's session. You may disconnect at this time.